Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. Good Faith is where followers of Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And this podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. Now, our world has been shaken by the news of the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. And every day we hear the latest revelation of the event itself, the manhunt, the background, potential motivations of the shooter. Now, our listeners can get this information in the news. What I hope to provide here is some sense of the larger meaning of this event, especially for followers of Jesus. And there's no better person to help us do that than founding friend of the Good Faith Podcast and regular guest, David French. David, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thanks, Curtis. It's always great to be back.
All right. Now, before we jump into those larger meanings, I actually wanted to ask you more personally, did you know Charlie?
Not well, only a little. We met briefly one time. We were both at the NRB, I believe it was NRB 2021, the National Religious Broadcasters Convention down in Texas. And by that point, I think I had disagreed with Charlie on a couple of things. He disagreed with me on a couple of things. And somebody knew that we were both there speaking and offered to introduce us. And so I said, yeah, that'd be great. So a mutual acquaintance introduced us, and we had a perfectly great conversation. I mean, we talked about, each other's families. We talked about, we talked through a couple of disagreements. We talked about possibly debating. Nothing ever came out of that, but it was a perfectly, pleasant conversation. And that's one thing that I think that you've heard a lot of people say about him is that when you interacted with him personally, he was often just really open to talking to people who disagreed with him, quite pleasant and polite in person. And so a lot of the sort of very pugilistic stuff you see online was not as reflected in sort of his one-on-one interaction. So yeah, that's the extent to that I knew him. And we volleyed back and forth on various issues over the years, but that's the extent kind of we didn't know each other really.
All right. Well, I want to start by, kind of honoring his mission. And his mission was to influence the young, influence high schoolers and college students with a particular, vision, MAGA vision of politics. Now, David, you and I have often talked about on this podcast how what happened in our adolescence shapes our view of politics or influences us.
Yes.
I still remember, right? Like, I think you and I are pretty much the same age. I remember when we heard news of the shuttle Challenger exploding. I was in the
vividly.
Cafeteria. Yeah. I was in a classroom, I think, when we heard that Reagan had been shot. I know I was in my friend's living room when the Berlin Wall fell. So given that, what does this presage for the future, for the next generation of Americans, given this event?
Oh man, there's so much to unpack on this, Curtis. The way I've put it is that it wasn't just that a man, a husband, a father of two young kids was killed over politics. All the best evidence we have so far is that it was motivated to some degree by politics. Although we'll learn more, hopefully, as all the investigation plays out. So number one, it is extraordinarily tragic, the murder, regardless of the reason. Number two, the murdering somebody for political speech is inherently shocking and destabilizing. And then number three, doing it on a college campus in broad daylight in front of thousands of people while he's engaged in debate is another factor on top of this. So it's just layer after layer after layer of awfulness. And on the one hand, I think that so what that means is I think we kind of have to think through the layers of what happened here and unpack them. Because I think that one of the things that we're really going to need to wrestle with is the fact that this took place on a college campus during a debate. I disagreed with Charlie Kirk about a lot. But one thing I really respected about him is that he went on these campuses and he would just sit there and he would talk to all comers. People came up and talked to him. Now, I didn't love some of his answers. I didn't like the way he responded sometimes. But, you know, tough confrontational speech and talk is not unusual on campuses. And in fact, you know, if you're a conservative, especially on elite campuses, you're very used to cruelty, to cruel, aggressive, pugilistic speech being directed at you. And so, you know, this sort of idea that, you know, the college campus was this really pristine debating environment before Charlie Kirk came around and you know, introduced his kind of MAGA pugilism. It's just false. I mean, I don't know if what your experience, you know, we haven't talked as much about your experience in undergrad at Harvard, but for me in the law school, the cruelty from some of my left-wing classmates and political opponents was over the top. Sometimes the dishonesty could be over the top. The pugilism could be over the top. And so, you know, the reality is that campus speech can sometimes be really a tough place. It can be a tough place. And I don't like it. I don't think it's right. But the idea that Charlie Kirk was coming in to campuses and doing something especially egregious is just not correct. Like it's just not correct. And so what he was doing was engaging in speech in a pretty tough and aggressive manner that is not outside the character of an awful lot of speech at that university or at universities more broadly. And he was shot and killed in broad daylight. And so the way I've put it is you didn't just have an attack on a man, a husband, a father that's evil and horrible on its own terms. You also had a bullet aimed at kind of the heart of the American experiment itself. This idea that, okay, we're going to debate, we're going to discuss. Sometimes it's going to be tough. Sometimes it's going to be hard to listen to, but it's going to be a debate. It's going to be a discussion. And there's no better place to have that than a college campus. And the bullet was aimed straight at that idea.
It's a great phrase. That the bullet was aimed at the idea of the American experiment. And it is really disturbing to me. I mean, by the way, to answer your question, I would say my undergraduate experience was less pugilistic and cruel in the sense you're saying, as it was, you know, when I look back on it, more ideologically homogenous in terms of, you know, kind of what the left was at that time. And so having somebody penetrate that to at least present a different set of ideas like a Charlie Kirk, I think would have been very healthy for me, for a lot of my friends and so forth. And, you know, the best way to read, you know, his work is he was doing that. And I've been really disturbed at thinking about what this is going to do to the next generation. I'll show you a stat or talk about a stat that I think you already know. But surveys show that while 93% of baby boomers agree that violence is never justified in politics, so 93% of baby boomers say no violence ever justified in politics. Among Gen Z, that figure is only 56%. So almost half of Gen Z think in certain contexts, certain circumstances, violence is justified. That's incredibly disturbing. David, is that really how bad it is from your perspective? Or is there something that the surveys are like these are sort of exaggerating?
So that's a great question. If push comes to shove, does that high percentage of people, as opposed to in the real world versus an abstract polling question, really truly want to see that kind of violence? I'm going to be skeptical about that. However, I do think directionally it is quite true that Gen Z is much less receptive to debate and dialogue and much more open to sort of political violence. And part of the reason why, Curtis, is let's just think about Gen Z's frame of reference. So, you know, I remember I have a distinct memory of a different era of American politics, very distinct memory of a different era. But Gen Z does not. And so let me make this a little bit concrete. So I talked to some college students recently who, you know, they had looked at the 2012 debate between Romney and Obama. So for you and I, that's a relatively fresh memory. It was 13 years ago. We were full grown adults when it happened.
Yeah.
I was watching, hanging on every word, rooting hard for Mitt, and I thought that was a pretty aggressive debate. I thought that was not outside the boundaries or anything, but I thought, man, that was a pretty aggressive debate. One of the things that a student told me was, I didn't realize that Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were friends. That the civility of that debate was such a dramatic contrast with the politics they've lived their whole lives around, that they thought that they were watching two friends debate, which is a really stunning kind of thing. And then so they have grown up with a politics of nonstop apocalyptic hyperbolic speech. They've grown up in the era of being told this is the Flight 93 election, that you win or we die. That this is, and so they're growing up in an environment where it is constant apocalyptic rhetoric. The planet's about to be destroyed. The democracy's about to die. If you lose this election, America is over and destroyed. Well, if you're hearing these things and believing them, it is not the next logical human thought to say, and therefore I must hear from these people and consider their arguments carefully, right?
No.
The next logical thing you're thinking is, how can I stop them, right? How can I throw my body in front of these people who will destroy America, take us back to Jim Crow, or destroy America and obliterate, want to, slaughter unborn life, like you name it. That very apocalyptic language creates its own momentum. And I was saying this in 2020, late 2020, before the January 6th attack. It's like, if you say America is going to end because an election was stolen, some people are going to believe you and they're going to act like it. And so I think that what you're seeing with Gen Z is you're seeing a lot of younger people who are starting to act like our rhetoric, so that they're taking our rhetoric seriously and acting like the rhetoric is being said seriously, which sadly, a lot of it is, Curtis. A lot of people do believe, if they're put under a lie detector test, they do believe that America won't survive the next presidential election. So this is the exclusive world that they've grown up with politically, is constant apocalypse and contention. That is not a world that is calculated to train us to listen to people respectfully. It's not a world calculated to train us to approach issues humbly. It's a world that's calculated from the ground up to hone you to be a fighter and a combatant in a culture war to the death. And so none of this should be surprising to us at all. It's a product of the formation that we have poured into Gen Z.
So where do you fit Charlie Kirk in all of that? Is he somebody that we would say, actually, he's you may disagree with the substance of his view, but he was still buying into, and in fact, reinforcing the American experiment, the liberal democratic values of free speech? Or do you say, no, he was actually, contributing to this pugilistic environment? It seems like there's a complex legacy here that we have to weigh.
Yeah, it's a yes to both. I mean, So on the one hand, he said, and this has gone around the internet, and he's exactly right. When we stop talking is when we start fighting. So, when we stop talking is when the physical fight breaks out. And he's right about that. And one thing I respected about him is he just went and talked and talked and talked and talked. One thing I did not like was how he talked sometimes, many times. And so, for example, he called for saying that, Joe Biden might need to face the death penalty, right? There were buses of people that TPUSA sent to January 6th. I mean, some of his rhetoric around the vaccine was just unbelievable. Some of his rhetoric around Ukraine, unbelievable. This is a guy who, you can do the chapter and verse of, the way in which he interacted and some of the things that he said. But I have not really done that since the assassination, and the reason why I've not really done that and really explained at length sort of the problems I had with some of what he said and how he said it is because compared to, I don't want to be in this world where the speech that he engaged in any way overshadows the horror of what occurred. And so I have not been spending my time amplifying over these last few days, amplifying and repeating my disagreements with Charlie Kirk. There are a lot of people in the larger political cultural world who have done and said things very similar to Charlie Kirk. I can argue with them. I can argue with them going forward. But I don't want to spend too much time on all of the disagreements I had with Charlie or the way he interacted with people, because I don't want to put the conversation about his speech on the same plane as the conversation about his death, if that makes sense. So that's not acquiescing to the way he communicated or acquiescing to all of the points that he made, et cetera. It's just saying the man's life and the loss to his wife and children and the loss to his friends and the people who loved him dwarfs in significance the beef that I might have or did have with a lot of the things that he said and did. And I think that it's so important that the gravity of the difference between an assassination and my distaste or dislike or even sometimes anger at the things that he said, those are not the same. They're not in the same universe, right? And so I think that that's an important distinction to draw, and one that I think is a very important distinction for Gen Z to hear, that the man was more than his political positions, and the man was more than his podcast. He was more than the encounters on college campuses. Human being created in the image of God, husband, father. Also, guess what, Curtis? A man in the middle of his own journey and his own life story. And there are points where, looking back on my life, if my life had been cut short and through any different, accidentally, intentionally, whatever, that what people would say about me is very different from what they'd say about me now, because it's a marathon, not a sprint, and sort of saying that this is the totality of who he was does not indicate the totality of who he could have become either. And I think that that's a very important thing for people to realize is, look, we're works in progress. And a lot of the people right now who are either cheering his death or maybe don't feel any particular sorrow about it or really want to double down on the bad things that he did, every one of those people is wrong about something, Curtis. Every one of them is wrong about something, and every one of them has expressed their ideas, including sometimes about Charlie Kirk, in a way that's repugnant. And so does that mean that it's okay for people to be fine with your death? Is it okay for people to celebrate your death? I mean, the idea that this would be, and again, I know that the vast majority of people have responded to this in the right way, and with the right level of grief and anguish for Charlie, without whitewashing, excusing, or sanctifying everything that he did. But there is a not insignificant number of people who have reacted with glee to this or don't mourn him at all. And man, that's to me, that's a very, very, very dark state of affairs. And what really concerns me is that although the political classes in America were largely, almost entirely, very, very responsible in the way they responded to this, there were statements from all living presidents that were just perfect and right. But I'm afraid that in part due to the forces being unleashed online, they're not in a position of leadership as much as they used to be.
David, I want to go back to this discussion about Gen Z and whether or not the humanizing allowance of debate, allowance of difference, values that you were talking about, where that's going to go with Gen Z. So I had earlier, just a little while ago, talked about this big generational divide between baby boomers and Gen Z, 93% versus 56% rejecting violence. And we began this conversation by saying how potentially influential one's adolescence and your experiences of politics during your adolescence can be in shaping your future. So I was doing a little mental experiment. I was like, all right, baby boomers, if they're like, 93% of them are rejecting violence in politics, what was their adolescence like? And then I realized, wait a minute, their adolescence was, let me just give you a few examples. The Watts riots of 1965, which caused 35 deaths. The murder of, Martin Luther King Jr., which led to riots in over 100 cities. Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, the leading, candidate in that particular election. And then the shooting of 4 students at Kent State by the National Guard, like by our military. So the baby boomers have experienced a tremendous amount of violence in their formative experience. So I was like, well, does this mean that there's still hope for Gen Z, that they're going to grow out of this as they go into adulthood? Or is there something that we've lost in moderating institutions in between the 1960s and now that are actually, are going to be problematic, the fact that we don't have them anymore? So I'd love your take on that.
I think I have to go with a yes to both again.
Okay.
So here's the interesting difference between the baby boomers and Gen Z, at least so far. So the baby boomers saw a level of political violence that, even though, 2020, the summer of 2020 was bad, January 6th was bad, and these recent, like the assassination of the Minnesota Speaker of the House, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, like we are seeing an uptick, increase in threats. It has not gotten anywhere near the scale that the baby boomers experienced. I mean, there was a point, and I wrote about this in my book, there was a point for about a year where there was on average more than one domestic terror bombing in the US a day. A day. When you look at sort of the histories of some of the rioting in the 1960s, nothing that we saw in 2020 is even close to it. Not even within the same shouting distance of some of the severity. I mean, look up at the Detroit riots in the 1960s were open urban combat between the army and rioters. Like the thousands and thousands and thousands of rounds fired by U.S. Army. I mean, it's just wild when you think about it. And so the boomers saw the fruit of political violence in a much more upfront and deadly way. And then the boomers saw political figures move past it and through it. And so you had, for example, after the chaos of the late 60s, early 70s, culminating in Watergate, fall of Saigon, et cetera, what happens is the American people elect in 1976 a Baptist Sunday school teacher, like literally a Baptist Sunday school teacher, and so all of a sudden that dramatic, you're talking about a person, although I had a lot of beefs with how he, many of his policies, no one can take on Jimmy Carter's integrity. And then after Jimmy Carter comes a Ronald Reagan, and a lot of Democrats don't have as fond a memory of Ronald Reagan, but you can look at his speech and his actions, and there's a fundamental difference between him and
I think many Democrats would like give a left arm for Ronald Reagan to come back and
right. I mean, just for his thought and ideas about immigration alone. I mean, look at his. So they saw darker violence and they saw brighter lights than Gen Z has. And so Gen Z is sort of, they've had a lot of apocalyptic rhetoric. They've had, by baby boomer standards, some political violence, but they have not stared into the abyss the way the baby boomers did. And so I feel like maybe with the baby boom, this is just kind of armchair psychoanalysis, that 93% is sort of due to the fact that, oh yeah, in my lifetime, we tried the political violence route and it's horrible. It's darkness. It leads us nowhere. Now, it's also true that the baby boomers were walking through this in a period of much heightened, much greater institutional trust, much greater sense of institutional stability, where you could have, and I still wonder if this is the case, where you could have responsible political leadership had massive cultural had large scale beneficial cultural effects. I am not as convinced of that now. I was doing a podcast with my colleagues, Jamel Bowie and Michelle Cottle, and we were talking about how one thing about the Charlie Kirk assassination that I think not enough people are talking about is that this was not the assassination of a politician. It was the assassination of an activist and an influencer. And that's not the norm, right? But it's also true that activists and influencers are now far more influential than politicians, almost any politician not named Donald Trump. And part of that is due to the fact that our trust in institutions has collapsed, and institutional leadership does not provide the kind of cultural cachet that it used to. And so now we are influenced much more by kind of these free agents. And the way to achieve influence in this sort of world of free agency isn't by ascending to responsible leadership of responsible institutions, but rather by being extremely attention-getting and pugilistic online, which creates a completely different set of incentives for how one elevates themselves and how and who you follow.
One of the things that's really, very striking, of course, is just in American life for, 10 years, 15 years, is just how everything gets reduced to partisan terms, right? And, I think you see the temptation, often people giving into temptation, to reduce this tragic event in similar ways to just partisan terms. And yet, you look at the history of political violence, it's quite bipartisan. I'm just going to take a moment here, David. You're familiar with this history, but just to refresh our listeners on the history of political violence in recent years. Now, you can pick any date you want to start, but let's start with 2011. Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, a Democrat, shot during a public event in Arizona. 2017, Representative Steve Scalise, Republican from Louisiana, shot, critically wounded during a congressional baseball practice. Then 2020, there's an attempted domestic terror plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, governor of Michigan, Democrat. 2022, armed man is arrested outside the house of conservative Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, there was a plot to assassinate him. 2022, Speaker of the House, Democrat Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, assaulted with a hammer, severely injured. Then you go to 2024. Of course, Donald Trump was shot on July during a rally. And then a few months later, there's another alleged assassination attempt. Then a few months after that, there's Governor Josh Shapiro, Pennsylvania Democrat, where there's an attempted assassination plot. And then I think, David, you referred to this earlier, just as early as June of this year, Speaker in the Minnesota House of Representatives, Melissa Hortman, and her husband were stalked, murdered. State Senator John Hoffman were stalked and shot. All of them, presumably, the wives were Democrats. So I guess my point in replaying this horrible, awful history is political violence is a bipartisan reality. And yet we still want to keep pulling this into our partisan terms.
Boy, I tell you, Curtis, you're singing my song on this. This was the subject of my Sunday column, which was basically launching off of a great statement by my friend Michael Brendan Dougherty, who is a senior writer at National Review. Years and years ago, we were talking about these very issues. And he said this. He said, for partisans, violence or corruption or whatever on the other side is emblematic. And when it's on our side, it's exceptional. And what he meant was, this is the way partisans think, is that if let's suppose I'm a deeply partisan Republican, you look at Charlie Kirk and you say, well, that's what they are doing to us. They, the left, they want us dead. And then that same highly partisan Republican would look at the assassination of the Minnesota lawmaker and say, well, you can't pin that on all of us. That guy was crazy. That guy was nuts. Or, yeah, look, I mean, there's millions and millions and millions of conservatives or, people on the right and Christians, et cetera. The odds that one of them is crazy is going to be pretty good. Why are you trying to tag us with that isolated individual act? And so you see how that works. So what ends up happening is that every negative thing on the other side becomes proof of your indictment of them. Whereas negative things that occur on your own side, you're going to view them as inherently isolated, ambiguous, who really knows what happened? And then you end up getting angry when the other side does to you what you do to them. So you're saying the left wants you dead. And then they say, when there's a right-wing act of right-wing terror, they'll go, the right wants you dead. And then you say, look at you generalizing against us. And so it creates this situation where every single act of terror, every violent act on the other side only totally reaffirms your view that the whole other side is bad. And every act of terror or violent act on your side, either you rationalize or excuse, or you say didn't exist, or it wasn't like that. Or if you can't find a way to say it didn't really happen the way the media said, then you just say, well, it's a very isolated action. It's nothing nearly as bad as the other side. And so then you're doing things like parsing studies that say, okay, well, in this study, it says the right kills more people than the left. And I think that's pretty well established that that as far as if you're looking at the number of people who've been killed in politically motivated shootings and violent attacks over the last several years, that the right has killed more people than the left, broadly speaking. But at the same time, it's not like you can look at the data and say that the left-wing extremists are healthy and peaceful. I mean, we just had, even though 2020 wasn't nearly as violent as, say, 68, it was still awful, right? And the violence in the cities across America in 2020 was really, really bad. And so, this idea that people will immediately run to when you accurately point out that there's a lot of violence, threats, intimidation coming from both sides of the political spectrum, if you're immediately running to say, well, which one does it a little bit more, or which one does it more, and then that's the real enemy, you're doing this all the wrong way. We have a violent extremism problem, period. And it's a violent extremism problem on the left and a violent extremism problem on the right. And while from an academic point of view, it can be helpful to sort of know who is doing what to whom, from a moral point of view, this sort of idea that, well, just because my stats say that the right has done more, or my stats say that the left is more violent in cities, does not mean then your partisan side is vindicated in all of this. One of the biggest problems right now that we have in our politics is that in this closely divided country, with both sides view the other as an existential threat, what that means is mainstream people on the right and mainstream people on the left are more willing than they should be to continue to accommodate in their constituency violent extremists, or extremists of any stripe, because they feel like if they let the tent shrink even a tiny bit, they'll lose.
Yeah.
And that sort of mindset, I think, is really helping sustain a lot of extremism, because unlike, say, 10, 15 years ago, you can be an absolute extremist and not be kicked out of the tent, so to speak, because they don't want to kick people out of the tent so long as that they can be allies against the hated foe.
David, you talked earlier about how, the difference between now and the 1960s is that it's a different kind of leadership that has the most influence. It's people online, it's influencers versus institutional leaders. And so the inherent moderating effect of institutions is lessened significantly. But it seems to me that institutional leadership that still matters. The statements, like you said, of the past presidents. I mean, still they exert some sense of shaping the broader culture, right? Talk to me about, like, in this moment, who are the leaders we ought to actually be really celebrating, following? Like, whose response to this have you really respected and said, yeah, we need more of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, let me applaud all the living former presidents
yeah.
who came out who came out clearly early, forcefully condemning political violence. But honestly, I don't think anybody has stood out more than Utah Governor Spencer Cox. I have for such a time as this, feeling about him, because he, for years, has been doing these disagree better convenings. So he's gone on the road and he's been out there in public for years talking about how we need to disagree better. He's allied with Democrats. He had a TV commercial with his Democratic opponent. Like he has done everything that an elected official knows how to do to try to get people to communicate with respect with each other and treat each other as human beings created in the image of God. And so when this happened in Utah, where he's governor, I had kind of two thoughts at once, that I'm certain this is incredibly painful for him that this happened in Utah when he has been trying to cultivate a sense of decency and morality in that state around public discourse for years. So I'm sure it's incredibly painful for him. At the same time, I was thinking of any governor in America, I would want him behind that podium. And he did not disappoint Curtis. His call to peace, to reconciliation, his compassion, it's been to watch people across the political spectrum respond to him and his words like they were water in the desert. It's just been incredibly heartening. And I think that he's been just exactly right to really emphasize that, look, the person who's going to prison for this, assuming, conviction, is the shooter and nobody else, right? Nobody else. And nobody else, unless we find that he had the accessories, nobody else is criminally responsible for this. But there is a cultural reality that our culture of animosity and viciousness, our own personal participation in animosity and vicious communication, is contributing to an atmosphere, an apocalyptic atmosphere. There is a we component here. And I think he's very accurate to say that. And so I think he's been really a gift to this country. And it's been his voice has been necessary because some of the worst, there's been two on the far right and the far left, two horrific responses to this. One of them is the total celebration of it you've seen from some quarters of the far left. Don't want to exaggerate it. It's not coming from the Democratic Party. It's not coming from the leading institutions of the left and the leading voices. It's coming from a lot of, hardcore online folks, and their message, their prominence is getting artificially inflated because it's enraging so many people. But at the same time, on the right side, you're seeing this sort of call to war almost, like they want you dead. They want you dead. Like taking the action of that assassin and imputing it to the left more broadly. Incredibly dangerous, incredibly dangerous. And so Spencer Cox, I think, has navigated this properly, and he's navigated it properly by not taking his eyes off the biggest thing, the most important thing, which is that a human being here was assassinated. And then also not taking his eyes off the fact that this assassination is, and all of the ones that came before it, are products of a culture. And that is a culture that we have collective responsibility for.
We've been navigating all these sort of different dimensions of the horrible act of murder of Charlie Kirk. David, I was thinking about you and your 2020 book, Divided We Fall, where you paint a scenario of America in the midst of a modern civil war. And I remember critics saying, this is an overreaction. This is a a apocalyptic vision that will never come to being. I'm hearing less of that these days.
Yeah.
So I guess I just wanted to ask you, like, if you had to rate where we are on the road to that really, apocalyptic vision, it's like, how would you evaluate things? Like, if
Yeah.
zero is impossible and 10 is a certainty, like, where are we?
Yeah. So when I wrote the book, I would have thought, like in early 2020, I would have said we're at about a 2.5 or a 3, but we're moving in the direction towards a 3.5 or a 4. And I don't see, and the reason why I wrote it is that I didn't see anything stopping us or slowing us down. Like there were no key people, cultural forces, trends, et cetera, that were arresting this momentum. So I'm sitting there waving my arms, jumping up and down, saying the momentum is bad here. That's like the first paragraph of my book is there's no significant social, cultural, political, religious trend that is pulling us together more than it's pushing us apart. And that thesis, very sadly, has been vindicated over the last several years. And I remember the same thing, Curtis, like people are like, yeah, we're divided, but David, you had the secession word in your subtitle. That's hysterical. That's ridiculous. And I'm like, and I was thinking, no, the thesis is not that this is going to happen. The thesis is we're pointed in a direction. We've got time to stop it. We have lots of opportunity to stop it, but we're pointing in a direction. And so I published the book in September of 2020. And January 6, 2021, nobody was like saying to me, why'd you write that book? And I would say, if January 6th put us to a 4, some events in between, and I would say we're more like at a 5, a 6, wow, heading in that direction. And again, we've got lots of opportunity to stop. We've got lots of opportunity to reverse. But when you see hugely influential people with huge followings basically saying, we can't share a country with these people, then you're absolutely moving down that road. And you just absolutely, if there's another thing that I want people to think is you cannot have the attitude that it cannot happen here. You can't look at like instability overseas and think, well, that's overseas. That's what happened. We're fine. It can happen here. It has happened here. Okay. So it can happen here. And, I frequently ask people, if you want to have a proper sense of gravity of the situation, list through a lot of the recent events that you listed through, Curtis, and then ask yourself, what would you be thinking if this happened in a foreign country? If you heard that list in a foreign country, you would say that country is not stable or it's teetering on the edge of instability. And so I feel like that is where we are. We're at a 5.5, a 6, and we're still moving in the wrong direction.
Well, given the gravity of the situation, I think what a lot of people feel is this huge asymmetry between what they actually do perceive something of the gravity of the situation, but their sense of ability to influence that outcome is greatly asymmetrical. Like it's like almost non-existent. So that's where people feel hopeless, is because they feel like things are going horribly, but I can't do anything about it. So what would you say to those people, which I think are many of our listeners?
Yes, I agree. And even making it worse, Curtis, I think if you are a very, very committed activist, you don't have that question of what can I do? Because there are plenty of institutions or organizations at the grassroots level that you can join and be a part of the cause. And however, it's very difficult to think of institutions, organizations that you can join and be a part of the cause that are much more focused towards reconciliation, much more focused towards building a community of respect and grace. How can I join that? Like, where am I signing up for that team, right? Because neither one of the political parties really fits that bill. And a lot of the activist organizations are all connected to sort of the larger ideological enterprise of their respective allied parties. And so it just doesn't feel like, if you're a human being who wants to see reconciliation, who wants to see peace, who wants to see a restoration of some degree of grace and tolerance in our society, where do you go to do that? And, and the simplest and shortest answer, and maybe even the most effective, is you start by modeling it. Like, even if there is no Americans for decency and respect, whatever, then you have to start by modeling it. And so that's the simplest and maybe the most effective thing that we can do. The other thing is, I do think that this idea of turning a restoration of American unity into its own cause, sort of a restoration of the proper understanding of American pluralism into its own cause, is an important thing. And a lot of people have been trying to do it. We both belong to and are affiliated with groups that are trying to do that. By and large, they're all sort of grass tips groups not grassroots groups. And so I think there's been a very good and diligent effort at forming a lot of grass tips groups where a lot of very smart people who are in the upper echelons of business and politics and the academy are gathering to try to work through this. It's just that the fruit of that is not leaking into the mass culture, and there isn't as much of a place within the larger culture where people can feel like they can be a part of that effort. And I think that's a missing link in our body politic right now.
Well, I think that's the real potential of the church, right? Because I think it's very difficult to build a separate institution, a separate sense of belonging, a separate sense of community only around moderation. Like that's just a really, like come and be moderate with us. But the church has both the community built in, but also the inherent value system. If it is a church following Jesus, the one who is the Prince of Peace, right?
I also completely, totally, utterly agree with you, Curtis, that the church is ideally positioned to be in this place. And also I would say we actually do have very, very important Christian figures who are doing this work. One of them is only the most important American Christian in the world, Pope Leo, right? And so you do have an environment where there are people and institutions who are trying to bring peace and reconciliation into our nation. And the church is ideally positioned to do it. It's to the great detriment of our culture and to the great sadness of many of us personally that it's chosen to be a participant in the pugilism in many instances, more so than an instrument of grace and mercy.
All right, David, last question. And with this last question, I wanted to end by honoring Charlie Kirk. Like you, I differed from much of the substance of his politics, but I want to honor him as a person. And it's important, I think, to note that he was a follower of Jesus. He was a fellow follower of Jesus who took his faith very seriously. David, talk about that. Like, what was the best way that Charlie imaged God, was an image of God, imaged the way God would be in this world?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you watch some of the clips of his interactions, there were moments when he was very capable of showing people real compassion, treating people with real respect. And, one thing that I wrote in the Times is that one thing I really respected about him is he just would go anywhere and talk to anybody. He was fearless and he'd show up. He'd do the work. If we're going to say, man, we really wish people dialogued more. Well, Charlie was putting that into practice. And also that he was absolutely not ashamed of his faith and his Christianity. He led with his faith and he led with his Christianity. And I think, again, you might say, well, he led with it in some ways that I don't agree with. Yes, I gotcha. I understand that. Guess what? I know that I've led with my Christianity in some ways that aren't great also. I would never presume that the way in which I have tried to walk in Jesus' footsteps has been in true imitation of Jesus. I'm such a poor proxy for him, right? And so we are all, in many ways, poor proxies. There is only one Jesus Christ. To have his ability to be the loving father for his children and the husband to his wife, having that just cut so short at such an early age, to me is an element of this tragedy because we focus so much on politics. In many ways, what you're talking about is the loss of the most important thing that he was going to be doing, right? There will be people and other voices who stand up in politics and will be impacting, but there is only going to be one dad to those two kids. And that loss is irreplaceable.
Well, David, thank you for helping us make at least a little more sense of all the nuances, the tragedies, the dangers, and of this particular horrific event. We're just, I know, beginning to unravel what all of this is going to mean. And listeners, I want to say, first of all, David, so thank you for coming back and helping us do that. And listeners, as we continue to do that, join us as we gather around the campfire.